My name is Andrew Savage. I was briefly introduced before. I am British, like our other, this is the British panel this morning. Don't worry, we haven't come to cause trouble. So I actually currently live in Berlin, where I'm the director for Germany of the Ronald S. Lauder Foundation, but I'm very excited to be in the process of relocating here to New York, where I'll be working with the Tikva Fund from the beginning of January. And this morning's session is of particular interest, obviously, as a British, as a European Jew. And I think it's of relevance to all of us. When Augustus became the first Roman emperor in the year 27 BCE, historians note that there were 7,000 Jews who lived in Rome. And since that time, Jews have inhabited Europe for more than 2,000 years. Jewish communities have been documented in Britain and Poland for over 1,000 years. The Jewish community in Lyon was established in the year 39. Jews came to Germany in the 5th century. Europe has been the setting for some of the most consequential Jewish achievements in history. Now, I must confess, as a British Jew growing up in the 1980s and 1990s, the question of whether we, as Jews, had a future in Europe was not one that particularly concerned my peers and me. There was a sense that our darkest days were behind us and the future looked secured. Now, that may have been a partial reflection of my naivety back then, but I also think it says something about the fact that this is now a discussion. Our future or lack thereof in Europe says a lot about some of the very real trends and changes that make up Europe. And so the question must be asked: European civilization and Jewish civilization share great achievements and a distinguished history, but do they share a future? That is the question we're asking today at this panel. What is the future and fate of European Jewry? How should we think about the challenges posed by secular progressive politics on the one hand, and the rising number of Arab and Muslim immigrants who are formed in cultures suffused with the most vile forms of anti-Semitic prejudice? We are thrilled to have two of the keenest analysts of the current European predicament to shed light on these questions. Daniel Johnson, who will speak first, is the distinguished editor of the Standpoint magazine, which if you don't read, you should. For in its pages, you will really find the most incisive writing anywhere on European culture and political affairs from a center-right point of view. It is a privilege to have him here with us today. We are also honored to have Melanie Phillips, who will speak after Daniel. Most of you have probably read Melanie in The Guardian, Observer, Sunday Times, the Daily Mail, or else her column in the Jerusalem Post. I must mention at this point there are also two very recent books, which if you haven't come across, are certainly worth looking up, that Melanie authored over the last 12 months. One is called Guardian Angel, My Journey from Leftism to Sanity. No guessing what the general thesis of that book is. And the other is Melanie's first novel, The Legacy, which is about Jewish identity and the power of history. Mr. Johnson, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a huge, Andrew, it's a huge privilege to be here. Now, Jews in Britain and more widely across Europe are confronted by a new mutation of the oldest hatred, the anti-Semitic alliance of the left and radical Islam. Now, it was Standpoint, the magazine of which I'm the founding editor, that brought the Labour Party's Jewish problem, in quotes. This is an excellent book by David Rich called Labour's Jewish Problem. So I'm using his phrase. To wider attention in 2013, when the well-known actress Maureen Lipman, a lifelong Labour supporter since the 40s, declared she could no longer vote for the party because of its extreme hostility to Israel and its intolerance of any other view. She castigated the then leader of the party, Ed Miliband, as a secular Jew for ignoring the problem and indeed being part of it. Her protest had a wide resonance, but the scale of the left's Jewish problem emerged only after Jeremy Corbyn came to office in 2015, after Miliband's defeat in the general election. Now, I too come from a family for whom this problem is personal. My father, Paul Johnson, was the editor of the New Statesman from 1965 to 1970. Many of you will have read his History of the Jews and other books. You might be pleased to know that he's celebrating his 90th birthday next week. But back in the 60s, he was one of the left's strongest voices in support of Israel. I still recall our jubilation at the outcome of the Six-Day War and the boxes of Jaffa oranges that would arrive from the Israeli embassy when my father had written a particularly trenchant essay in Israel's defense. I suppose those oranges would be enough to land us in trouble under a future Prime Minister Corbyn, or even be used as evidence of the imaginary Israeli conspiracy to control British politics that he regularly demands should be investigated. Now, my father left the Labour Party to join Margaret Thatcher in 1977, as it happens, while I was in Israel. I was working on a kibbutz. We were on the left, remember, in those days. I vividly remember the front page news item about him in the Times saying Paul Johnson leaves the Labour Party and wondering where this bold move, fraught with professional risk, would lead. Well, 40 years later, I think he has been vindicated. There are still decent people in the Labour Party, but many of them have despaired of reforming it. The long march through the institutions that began in the 1970s has brought the enemies of society, as my father called them back then, to the brink of power. If Brexit goes badly, and it may well do, given the malice of Brussels and the muddle of Westminster, then the public will blame the Conservatives. Britain could elect a Labour Prime Minister who is not only unfit to lead his country, but who hates it so much that he has refused to sing the national anthem. So I shall start with the flags. Some of you may be familiar with the British tradition of the last night of the proms, when the Royal Albert Hall resounds to patriotic music with a great deal of singing, swaying, stamping, and waving of flags. The flags in question are, of course, mainly Union Jacks, though since the vote for Brexit, they've been almost outnumbered by a great variety of European flags, and especially the EU flag. There is much disapproval of any public display of national symbols in Europe, in stark contrast to the United States. Indeed, the main thing that unites otherwise disparate European elites is fear of and hostility to populism and nationalism. So those who wave the Union Jack at the last night of the proms are the target of condescension and disdain, or worse, even from the BBC, which actually sponsors the event. Yet no such animosity greeted the unprecedented, though by no means spontaneous, flag-waving that erupted at the Labour Party conference last month. Not that any member of what was once the party of Clement Attlee and Tony Blair would be seen dead waving a Union Jack. No. The eruption of flags brandished by the far-left delegates, who now dominate the largest progressive party in Europe, elicited no censure. That's because they were Palestinian flags. The flags alone were disturbing enough, but the context made them even more provocative. The Labour Party has been embroiled in the burgeoning scandal of left-wing anti-Semitism ever since Jeremy Corbyn became its leader in 2015. Last summer, new revelations of institutional prejudice against Jews or extreme attitudes to Israel, together with attempts by the leadership to suppress criticism or to purge the critics, made the front pages almost daily. So it was striking that Labour was so indifferent to the pain of the Jewish community, not to mention the damage done to its own reputation, that it could mount a pro-Palestinian demonstration at its annual gathering. It wasn't just the flags. In his speech to the conference, Corbyn announced that his first act on becoming Prime Minister, on day one, before anything else, would be to unilaterally recognize Palestine as a sovereign state. This was to add injury to insult, for he gave no indication of where the borders of this Palestinian state would be. Many Palestinians would prefer a one-state to a two-state solution, while some genuinely envisage a binational state. Many more dream of erasing Israel and its Jewish inhabitants from the map. Corbyn identifies not just with the Palestinians, whom he sees as the great cause of our time, but with the most radical elements within their leadership. One indication of how far he might go is the row over Raed Salah, a prominent Palestinian who in 2011 was leader of the Islamic movement, an extremist organization in Israel close to the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. This man was deemed so dangerous by the then Home Secretary, now Prime Minister, Theresa May, that she banned him from entering the UK. One example of Saleh's repertoire must suffice. In 2007, he gave a speech in Jerusalem in which he endorsed the medieval blood libel, accusing Jews of mixing the blood of the children of Europe in their holy bread, as he put it. Yet such a man was invited by Corbyn to take tea on the terrace of Parliament. He and his friends mounted an ultimately successful campaign to have the ban on Saleh lifted, accusing Theresa May of prejudice and suggesting that her decision could have been influenced by Jewish donors to the Conservative Party. So those who object to the public propagation of the most ghoulish fiction in the whole demonology of anti-Semitism are themselves targeted as sinister manipulators of the political system. Another example of Corbyn's pathological refusal to face the truth was his reaction to the suspension from the Labour Party of his old ally Ken Livingstone, the former mayor of London, for repeating the outrageous lie that Hitler was a Zionist, implying that Zionists were therefore in some sense accomplices and successors of the Nazis. According to a reporter for the left-wing Vice magazine, Corbyn's only reaction when told that Livingstone had been suspended was to ask, "Can anyone tell me what Ken's done wrong?" Corbyn saw nothing anti-Semitic in a mural painted in London's East End by the American graffiti artist Kalan Ockerman, also known as Mere One. It depicted hideous hook-nosed capitalists playing Monopoly on the backs of the oppressed. When Jews protested, and even the borough mayor, a notorious Islamist, ordered the mural to be removed, Corbyn protested. These incidents are no aberration. Corbyn's offensive conduct towards Jews and anyone else who challenges his complicity in anti-Semitism forms a consistent, lifelong pattern of behavior. He personifies the pathology of the left throughout the West, admittedly in an extreme form. For hardline leftists, Israel is the archetypal enemy of the archetypal victims, Muslims in general and Palestinians in particular. The creation of a Jewish state was the root of all evil for these people because it has given Western imperialism and capitalism a permanent bridgehead in the world of Islam, a bastion of the global bourgeoisie in the midst of the new proletariat. The existence of Israel is a challenge even to liberal Europeans because its proud defense of its national identity and independence calls into question the internationalism of the EU. But for the hard left, Israel is not merely an awkward anomaly to be alternately chastised or cold-shouldered. For them, Israel is an archenemy that must be crushed. Hence, Corbyn shares platforms with his friends, as he calls them, of Hamas and Hezbollah, broadcasts on Iranian TV, and lays wreaths to commemorate the perpetrators of the 1972 Munich massacre of Israeli Olympic athletes. We have the extraordinary spectacle of a man with every likelihood of becoming British Prime Minister who deliberately aligns himself with those who would advocate a second Holocaust. One might suppose that if Corbyn were to find himself in Downing Street, the mandarins of Whitehall would sabotage any attempt by his government to carry out extremist policies. But that assumption does not hold water. The election of a Corbyn government would usher in a period of such chaos that any resistance within the British establishment would struggle to organize itself. The United States and Israel, which have always shared intelligence and much else with Britain on a mutually beneficial basis, would have no choice but to desist from all cooperation with Corbyn's revolutionary regime. But that would also weaken the opposition. And we know from our experience of Brexit how much we can rely on our European partners. One opportunist, though, would scarcely fail to seize his chance. The Kremlin's offer of an Anglo-Russian reset would be irresistible to Corbyn. We know this because he has never knowingly criticized any policy emanating from Moscow, and because from Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin, to Vladimir Putin, Russian leaders have known exactly how to exploit the useful idiots of the West. From a Jewish point of view, there is an ominous continuity in Russian policy, which has always been implicitly or explicitly anti-Semitic, often thinly disguised in campaigns against cosmopolitanism, openly hostile towards Zionism or any other assertion of Jewish identity, and generally supportive of Israel's enemies. Corbyn is not alone. There are plenty of useful idiots among the elites of the European Union who, given the chance, would follow the example of Gerhard Schröder, the last social democratic chancellor of Germany, who has been a pawn in Putin's game since the day he left office. And the ideological currents run deep. The president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, gave a speech earlier this year in Trier, the birthplace of Karl Marx. Juncker is no Marxist, but he praised Marx uncritically as a prophet of the European idea. Among his many other lethal legacies, Marx's, which have cost 100 million lives and still legitimize the greatest tyrannies on earth, Marx was the most important begetter of left-wing anti-Semitism. His imagery of the Jew as a worshipper of money and his demand for the emancipation of society from Judaism still pollutes the mainstream of European thought. Marx is, of course, not the only source of this poison. Centuries of Christian anti-Judaism prepared the ground for secular anti-Semitism, which has returned to Europe with a vengeance as the memory of the Shoah fades. And it finds its most fertile ground in the Ummah, those who have inherited the cities of a Europe that imagines itself emancipated from its Judeo-Christian history. The oldest hatred flourishes, in the late V.S. Naipaul's phrase, among the believers. Anti-Semitism has its own tradition in Islam, as we have been all too forcibly reminded in recent decades. The Salafists and other Islamists do not need to borrow ideas from the putrefying ideologies of either Nazis or communists in order to pose a mortal threat to Jews everywhere. Yet the political Islam that has emerged in the last half-century is, like Nazism and communism, hostile not only to Jews, but to Western civilization as such. It has made great strides in marginalizing those Muslims who seek integration and view the West positively. For political purposes, it is the Islamists who have mobilized the Muslim masses and made themselves essential to the cause of the left. A quick tour d'horizon shows a European Union falling apart at the seams, even as its political doctors prescribe the same medicine that has made the patient worse. Mass immigration, intended to solve the demographic symptoms of a society that has lost faith in itself, is bringing on a political crisis that is sweeping away hitherto dominant parties, policies, and politicians. In France, we have witnessed a populist movement led by a president who defines himself as the anti-populist. Emmanuel Macron is still riding high and faces no opposition, but his support is shallow, and the foundations of French civil society are still crumbling. More Europe isn't the solution, nor even the right problem. However often Macron repeats the mantra. More nationalism on the model of de Gaulle might be part of the answer, but although Macron recently made a pilgrimage to Colombey-les-Deux-Églises to celebrate 60 years of the Fifth Republic, he increasingly resembles not the general, but a less auspicious role model, Napoleon III, the first president of France who made himself emperor after a coup d'etat, but whose reign ended in defeat and humiliation. In Germany, the party system has not collapsed, but instead fragmented. 6 parties vie for the votes of an aging, anxious, and angry electorate, the same number that we had at the end of the Weimar Republic. Observers are mesmerized by the sight of new neo-Nazis on the march, openly defying the law with Hitler salutes in city centers. The Alternative for Germany party has broken the taboo on right-wing politics and put Angela Merkel's Christian Democrats under huge pressure. But the malaise runs deeper. The venerable Social Democratic Party is on life support, as more radical parties of the left replace it with their formula, if you can't beat the Islamists, join them. Italy is perhaps the most dramatic example of the havoc wrought by the custodians of a civilization that has turned against its most ancient traditions. It was no accident that the founding treaty of the EU was signed in Rome more than 60 years ago. It was a conscious attempt to evoke the grandeur of both ancient and medieval Roman empires, with a large admixture of Marxism from the Italian communist visionary Altiero Spinelli, after whom the European Parliament names its largest building. What actually emerged was a form of federalism that, unlike its American counterpart, rejected the legitimacy of the nation-state, which was deemed to have failed in Europe. Yet it is not the nation-state, but the European superstate that is blamed for the present crisis, and rightly so. Italy has been the first port of call for the most recent wave of migration from the Muslim world, yet it is powerless to control its borders, which has made the electorate acutely aware of the loss of sovereignty implied by membership of the Eurozone. With the moral architecture of this European experiment in ruins, Italians have abandoned their post-war parties and elected a government that is unashamedly nationalist. The Interior Ministers promised to deport 500,000 illegal migrants and spent far beyond the budgetary limits imposed by Brussels, with which Rome is now on a collision course. Italy, hitherto the most fragile of nation-states, is uniting against the enemy, the European dream of abolishing nations and borders, a dream that has become a nightmare. And the migration problem, itself a euphemism for the political and cultural problem of unassimilated Islam, divides the whole of Western and Northern Europe. Swedish politics and society are, if anything, in worse shape than Germany's, for example. Only in Central Europe is there something approaching consensus in favor of a nation-state based on common values. These values are essentially Judeo-Christian, despite generations of communist rule. And even in Western Europe, the only values that offer hope of restoring equilibrium are the biblical ones, filtered through enlightenment and modernity, no doubt, but with the God of Israel still discernible amid the chaos, the creator of a rational universe and a moral order, whose commandments serve as the ultima ratio for a humanity formed in the imago Dei. Islam presents a direct challenge to the survival of this irreducible core of Western civilization. The Quran posits a different universe from the Bible. Hence, Oriental and Occidental civilizations have often clashed. It is as yet impossible to foresee whether the nations of Europe will be able to find a modus vivendi with Islam. Such a modus vivendi would enable Jews, Christians, and others to... I beg your pardon. I seem to have lost my text. I've run out of time anyway. I think some sort of divine authority must have told me to shut up now. So I'm going to stop. But I just wanted to say we need to go back to a time when Jews and Christians could make common cause against our enemies, and when we could feel confident in our support for our nations together. And I think that is the basic message that I have. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed for having me today. Technology, eh? I shall try and make my iPad work without making complete holics of it. As we know, these are really bad times for Jews in Britain and Europe. There are three sorts of threat that Jews are facing: from the left, from the far right, and from Muslims. All these threats to the Jews are connected to each other. All are rooted in threats to Britain and to Europe themselves. All are creating a perfect anti-Jewish storm. And of course, as we've seen from the tragic events of the weekend, America is touched by exactly the same madness, although it takes different forms. Anti-Semitism is all around us, once again, but it is very little understood. We seem to have learned as a culture very little from the Holocaust, because anti-Semitism is not just another prejudice. It is not even just an exterminatory prejudice. Anti-Semitism is a profound moral and spiritual sickness. And this is not understood, and that failure to understand it is fueling its ominous reappearance. Now, Jews in Britain and Europe are asking themselves the same question all the time now. Is it time to go? Should we stay? Are we repeating the errors of the past in not recognizing the threat when it is upon us? Well, the answers to this question are different everywhere, and they're different, I would suggest, in Britain from mainland Europe. On mainland Europe, the threats to Jews are much more violent and much more severe. For example, in Paris last spring, an 85-year-old survivor of the Shoah, Mireille Knoll, was stabbed to death and her body burned by a young Muslim. Last year, a man shouting Allahu Akbar beat up Jewish schoolteacher Sarah Halimi and threw her to her death out of her Paris apartment window. In January, a teenage girl in the Paris suburb of Sarcelles, wearing the uniform of her Jewish school, was slashed in the face with a knife. Later that month, an 8-year-old boy was beaten in the same area because he was wearing a kippah. In February, 2 Jewish men in Paris were attacked with a hacksaw amidst a volley of anti-Semitic abuse. In Amsterdam, a kosher restaurant, which has been repeatedly targeted for attack, had its windows smashed by a man holding a Palestinian flag and shouting Allahu Akbar. Holland's chief rabbi says taunts in the street of dirty Jew or curses against Jews are now quite normal. At the beginning of Hanukkah last year, 2 Syrians and a Palestinian firebombed a synagogue in Gothenburg, Sweden. A few days later, a Jewish cemetery in Malmö in Sweden was attacked. In Germany, the Israeli flag has been burned and Jewish pupils bullied by Arab schoolmates, and so on and on. In the United Kingdom, as you have heard so eloquently from Daniel, there is intense alarm over Jeremy Corbyn, possibly the next British Prime Minister. There are some astonishing examples of anti-Semitism from his own party members. Tropes such as Jewish money controlling the world and all that. And I won't go into detail about Corbyn because you've heard about it from Daniel, but it's the failure by him to shut this down, and more ominously than that even, the general indifference by the general population to anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and a bewilderment about what it means. Isn't it just criticism of Israel? Why are they all going on about anti-Semitism, all these Jews? And this has meant open season against Jews on social media. One most recent example as of yesterday. After Shabbat, a British Jewish lawyer of my acquaintance, a man of the left, a man with whom he would be horrified had he known that I was even mentioning his name today, so I won't mention his name in case it offends him. But after Shabbat, he turned on his Twitter feed and he tweeted, he found out what happened. He found out what happened in Pittsburgh. And he tweeted, "Turned on my phone after a lovely day attending synagogue with my family, with its security guards with bulletproof vests, and I see our community's worst nightmare come true." That's what he tweeted. To which another Jewish lawyer tweeted in reply, quote, "Have people been shot at synagogues in the UK too? That would be terrible. If, as I suspect, not, perhaps the bulletproof vests would be more use in Gaza against Israeli assassins. Every expletive deleted day. Maybe they do them in children's sizes too." Close quote. So this encapsulates the problem. We have here the use of the demonic child killer trope used against Jews since time immemorial, now being used against the Jews of Israel. We see the Jews of Israel being turned from victims into aggressors, and we see a British Jew expressing this bigotry. Because on the left, the anti-Semitism is being fueled and even led against Israel by Jews, and you have this here too as well. Now, attacks on Jews in the United Kingdom are at record levels, and a disproportionate number of those attacks, both physical and verbal abuse, are being committed by Muslims. Now, even to mention that fact is, of course, Islamophobic, so I hope that you will be duly shocked that I have done so today. In Europe, the kind of attacks I've been listing, and there's only a few of them, are overwhelmingly committed by Muslims, and this fact is ignored. The French government expresses concern about this. It expresses concern about the security of French Jews, but it's very erratic in what it does about this. And as we could see when Charlie Hebdo was attacked, and then very shortly after that, the Jewish supermarket and school were attacked, and people were killed in the Jewish supermarket. As the Jews of France bitterly observed, those attacks on Jews would have passed virtually without comment had it not been for the fact that they came on the heels of the Charlie Hebdo attack, which of course got so much traction. You would not have had people marching in the streets in Paris saying, you know, we are all Charlie. They would not have had them saying we're all Jews had it simply been attacks on Jews. Now, in Europe and elsewhere in the West, in Britain and here, there is a threat of violence and anti-Semitism in general from the far right. But the threat is, as we've seen from these tragic events in Pittsburgh, very real. But it is smaller. It is smaller than the threat from the far left, from the left and from Muslims. Now, in Europe, in mainland Europe, this fact that the far right is not the main threat is very much complicated by the fact that some nationalist or populist groupings that have arisen in recent years, they have their roots, some of them, in fascist or racist parties, but they are now professing warm feelings towards Israel and towards the Jewish people, much warmer than parties on the left. And this is causing a great deal of concern and confusion in our discourse in general. For example, Hungary's President or Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, is said to be an anti-Semite. I won't go into the detail of why, but he is said to be an anti-Semite. Now, in Britain, the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, have a problem. They have a problem with the education inspectorate called Ofsted. Ofsted, responding to the dictates of the British Conservative government, has come to the conclusion that the way you deal with Islamic extremism is that you deal with separatism. That the problem of Islamic extremism, says the British Conservative government, is that communities keep themselves separate. And consequently, Ofsted, in order to protect the country against Islamic extremism, is telling the Haredim that in their schools they must teach gay rights. Work it out. So the Haredim, without going into that particular private grief, the Haredim, take it from me, are fighting this. And the Haredim say, if we cannot bring up our children in our own schools according to our own precepts, which is basically not to teach not just about gay rights, they don't teach sexuality, they believe it's a private thing. Now, we can all disapprove of that or whatever, but that's their thing. And the Haredim say, if we can't do that anymore as British Jews, we can no longer be British Jews. We will have to leave. So they're fighting Ofsted for this right to teach their children in the way that they want. And when asked what you will do, what will you do if you can't teach your children in the way that you want, where would you go? They said, the safest place for us to go is Hungary. And they're correct. And do you know why they're correct? Because Hungary has a very significant problem of anti-Semitism, but its anti-Semite, quote-unquote, president, Viktor Orban, is keeping them as firmly in check as he can, and he has set his face famously and infamously against the incursion of Muslims into Hungary, for which he is denounced as a xenophobe, as an Islamophobe, and as an Islamophobe, he must therefore be a Nazi, and as a Nazi, he must therefore be an anti-Semite, and therefore Hungary is a dangerous place for Jews. Actually, Hungary is one of the safest places in Europe at the moment for Jews. Go figure. That's the confusion that we face. Now, we've heard there is a tremendous threat from Jeremy Corbyn, not just to Jews, but to everybody, from Jeremy Corbyn if he were to come to power as Prime Minister because of his ultra-left policies. If he were to come to power, what would Jews face in Britain? Well, he would, I think, do various things. As Daniel has suggested, he would take action against Israel. We would see arms embargoes. We would see, boycotts. He would drive a wedge down the British Jewish community between those for whom that sort of behavior towards Israel is insupportable and those for whom Israel doesn't really matter. or who in fact share some of the prejudices. And I think that he would give a kind of unspoken signal that to those who wish Jews harm, both physical and otherwise, in Britain, it's like, hands off. Jews would not feel as supported as they have been so far. Now, he refuses to believe that he can possibly be anti-Semitic. The left refuses to believe they can possibly be anti-Semitic because the left are anti-racist. They are the embodiment of all things good, all things virtuous, and therefore they are not anti-Jewish. They are simply anti-Israel, and they can show this by showing their friends among anti-Israel Jews, of whom there are more than a few, as you have here. They are also very hostile to capitalism, and as we all know, the Jews run capitalism, the Jews run the money markets of the world. And so these attitudes towards Israel and towards capitalism, they are articles of faith, they will never change. Jeremy Corbyn's faction will never change. And Labour moderates are completely paralyzed. They have gone along with this for too long, they've lost control of their party. I doubt whether they can ever get it back. But the problem of anti-Semitism on the left goes far beyond Jeremy Corbyn and precedes him by a very large number of years. The left has been anti-Israel for years. It's been anti-Jew for years through this camouflage of its anti-Israelism. There have been repeated marches on the streets of Britain where the left has marched shoulder to shoulder with Islamists screaming, "Death to Israel." Personally, I was first accused of not being properly British when I first spoke up for Israel in 1982, when I had never been to Israel and never wanted to go. I spoke up for it as a simple matter of truth and justice and fairness, and I immediately crossed a line and I was regarded as no longer properly British. And in the year 2001, I was accused to my face on national television of dual loyalty. I'd been to Israel at that point precisely twice to see my daughter, who was on her gap year there. But because I spoke up for Israel, I was guilty of dual loyalty and was effectively a traitor to Britain. So is it possible to turn this round? Well, this sickness that I've been describing is afflicting not just Britain and Europe, but the West in general. We've seen it in America over the weekend in Pittsburgh. We see it all the time on your campuses. We saw it when Walton Mearsheimer produced their dreadful book, The Israel Lobby, which of course, by which they meant the Jewish lobby. Anti-Semitism always denotes a society in deep trouble. When a society is in deep trouble, it stops pulling together and it starts turning upon itself, and the people it most turns on are always the Jews. Now, why is it doing this? Well, I would suggest that the main problem is on the left. The West has been under assault for decades by leftists trying to destroy it through its normative values, through education, through traditional family, through things like multiculturalism, through moral and cultural relativism. The institutions of the West have been under fundamental attack because what's been behind all this is the belief that the Western nation, Western culture itself, is innately rotten because it's exclusive, it's white, it's colonialist, it's therefore racist, and so transnational institutions must take precedence. And behind all this is a loss of belief in the West itself, in progress, in modernity. And I believe that this actually arose as a result of the Holocaust. The Holocaust took place in the high culture, the place which was the apex of high culture in the West, Germany. And this kind of smashed to smithereens, I believe, Europe's belief in itself as the exemplar of superior cultural values. I would suggest it wasn't just the Jews who died in the extermination camps, it was also the West's concept of itself as moral and rational. And the loss of belief in religion strikes at the very core of Western civilization. We can see this demoralization all over in Europe, not just through anti-Semitism, through its declining birth rate. It's literally not replacing itself. It does not have hope in itself as having a future. It is a profound cultural demoralization of which anti-Semitism is a symptom. National identity has been replaced by factional interest groups with competing power blocks. Biblical morality has been replaced by man-made universalizing ideologies such as moral or cultural relativism or multiculturalism. Now, the thing about these ideologies is that every single one of them is either anti-Judaism or anti-Israel. And it's not surprising. Jews are always in the way of any universalizing ideology. We are the people of one book alone and of one land alone. This is something many diaspora Jews try to deny. They try to pretend, especially here in America. So many American Jews try to pretend that universal liberal values are Jewish values. They are not. Jewish values are rooted in the Hebrew Bible. They have an application universally. They have universal application, but they are rooted in the particulars of the Hebrew Bible. And if you deny the Hebrew Bible, you deny those universal goods, such as belief in the innate dignity of every human being, belief in the idea that we should subjugate our own desires in the common interest to create a society. These are Jewish ideas and ideals we have given the world. And if, as you have, the left and the forces of secularism are striking at religion, and at the biblical religion in particular, as being the fount of all evil, what they're striking at is the very fount of Western civilization, and it's not surprising, therefore, that the people really in the crosshairs of this onslaught are the Jews, both in religion and in the state of Israel, because it's not just that Jewish precepts are at the heart of the Western ideas, Western ideals, but Israel is the original paradigm ethnic nation state. To be a nation state is bad, to be an ethnic state is evil, to be a Western ethnic national state, and people believe that Israel is Western, they must be crazy, but anyway, that's another matter. Israel is therefore triply damned. So that's the left, but there are two other factors, as I've mentioned. There's Muslim anti-Semitism. Jew hatred pours out of the Muslim world with Nazi-style blood libels, Iran-threatening genocide. Muslim discourse is dominated by anti-Jewish, barking mad, deranged conspiracy theory. The protocols of the elders of Zionists believed as true. The Jews are behind 9/11. Israel is out to destroy the Islamic world. The Jews control the media, the finance, and so on and lunatically on. But here's the thing. Exactly the same demented anti-Jewish conspiracy theories are being put about by the left and by the far right. The left said the war in Iraq was a conspiracy by Israel in concert with the White House. The Pittsburgh synagogue attacker has been reported as using language identical to the language used by Louis Farrakhan. The left, however, will not criticize Muslims because that's Islamophobic. They actually enable, therefore, Muslim anti-Semitic discourse to run rampant. And so anti-Jewish conspiracy theories have become normalized. The left marches with the Islamists. The Islamists sing the same song as the neo-Nazis. Jeremy Corbyn has been backed over his attitude to Jews by David Duke and the British neo-Nazi Nick Griffin. The left, the Islamists, and the far right are a trifecta of evil. Now, the left and the Muslims are most dangerous because they are, especially the left, they are the most powerful. The far right are clearly a threat, but their numbers are small and they are powerless. But the left, which controls the culture, seizes upon the violence by the far right because that allows them to pretend the problem is not on their own side. And so we find that anti-Semitism and the Holocaust have been weaponized for political ends. Both Republicans and Democrats, I'm afraid to say, call each other fascists. But among the Democrats of the Democratic Party, it is commonplace to compare President Trump to Hitler and the Republicans to Nazis. And in Britain, anti-Semitism on the left is still denied. What we're seeing is a level of hysteria. I would suggest that there's a sense of reason itself, of rationality, being denied on all sides. People are not prepared to listen to evidence. They're not prepared to admit to complexity or nuance. You are on one caricaturable side or another. So the future isn't bright. The divisions will deepen. I would guess in Europe in particular, social disorder and violence will increase, and you can bet that the Jews are going to get it from all sides. So in answer to the great question, is it time for the Jews of Britain and Europe to go? I won't even ask you in this great country the same question. Well, it's a very personal decision. I made my own choice in this matter. Until the year 2000, I had never been to Israel and never wanted to go to Israel. In that year, I went twice to see my daughter, as I have said. Within a year or two of that, I came to the conclusion that we British Jews, had been living for the past half century in a fool's paradise, and it was over in the sense of ever being confident that we were living in the best possible place for us. We should no longer think that. I no longer felt comfortable. I decided to relocate my center of gravity to Israel. I now spend most of my time in Israel, but I am very much between two worlds. I remain deeply committed to fighting for Britain and the West, and I believe it is my duty and it's the duty of all of us as Jews to fight for the survival of the West. But I have become, to my amazement and surprise, a Jew with her suitcase packed. Israel, I find, is where Jews are not on their knees, where they know they are fighting the enemies of civilization, where the birth rate is as high as their optimism and their economy, and where I have come to believe it is where a Jew should be. But this is very personal. This is very personal, and I wouldn't presume to tell anybody else that they should be anywhere else. It is very difficult to up and go, very, very difficult indeed, and everybody has to make up their own mind about the calibration of pain, of staying and of going. And it is still perfectly possible for British Jews to live without feeling any discomfort at all. If you're the kind of Jew who lives in a bubble in Jewish North London, you work there, or you work in central London, you can still travel to central London wearing your kippah without a problem. There are only certain areas where you can't wear your kippah. Your friends are all Jews. You all think the same kind of thing. You don't much care about Israel. It's not for you. You tune it out, or you think, if only Netanyahu would drop dead, there'd be peace in the world. If you're that sort of Jew, you have no problem in Britain being a Jew. So it's very subjective, but objectively, the question is it all over for the Jews of Britain and Europe? Well, this is an unanswerable question. I would suggest, to bring my remarks to a conclusion, I would suggest this. In the West, we are at an inflection point. I believed that until a couple of years ago, the West did seem to be on an unalterable path down and out, on a kind of suicide mission off the cultural cliff. But I believe that as a result of two things that happened in 2016, the vote for Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, the fight is now on between the defenders of the West, the Western nation and its core values, and those who wish to destroy them. In the United Kingdom, we had Brexit. Here you had Trump. In Europe, they've got mass immigration and the rise of their populist political parties. These are all different in different respects, and who knows how any of these things is going to turn out. But I would suggest they're all linked by a common factor. It's a revolt by millions of ordinary, decent, patriotic people attached to their nation in Britain, in America, in Europe, and who care about the values of the Western nation and believe that those values are anchored in a history and tradition and culture which they share with other like-minded souls. It's a revolt by them against an establishment which disdains them and vilifies them for caring about those things, an establishment which stretches across mainstream parties. That's why you have all these little these populist parties popping up in Europe. So the fight is on. Anti-Semitism is part of a much more fundamental struggle. It's not as simple as we Jews against the rest. It is, and not just because, unfortunately, Jews, we find, are leading the charge against the West, both here and in Britain. It's a fight between two views of the world, two views of how the world should be, and two views of what humanity itself is, two views over how we should live in this world, two views about what it means to be moral and what it means to be human. And I'm afraid Jews are on both sides in this terrible and great fight. And it is a fight to the death. There is everything to play for. One side has to win, the other side has to lose. And it's not just the future of Jews in Britain and Europe that is at stake here. It is the future of the West itself. Thank you.